This is Urban Health Today, and I'm speaking with Quinton Maidment, Vice President of the Bliss Group and one of the leaders of the clinical trial recruitment business. He's here to talk about the clinical trial enrollment process. Thanks for being here with me today,
Oh,
Quinton.
thank you for having me.
It's really good to have you here, and let's jump into it. Can you describe your primary responsibility as a marketing company in facilitating clinical trial enrollment?
Yeah, so at CTRX Pathways, so we work with pharmaceutical companies, academic institutions, health tech companies to help them recruit patients for clinical trials. We do this essentially through the creation of a lead generation engine that basically sends leads to clinical researchers, and these leads likely match the inclusion and exclusion criteria of that specific clinical study that we're working on. This is done through sort of a combination of data and analytics to sort of identify where potential enrollees are, both digitally and physically, paid media, advertising, earned media, like interviews with local publications, grassroots outreach. Sometimes that's like a partnership with a community-based organization. Sometimes that's actually physically pounding the pavement in areas with high rates of a specific disease. And then we sort of develop a website and a call center to sort of funnel through people through to the trial site.
Now,
We
what is
also,
CTRX?
this stands for clinical trial recruitment, and the RX would be like a prescription, like an RX. It was just the name we gave the
Just a catchy
the
name.
business
Got
line.
it.
Yeah. And then we do some ancillary services too.
Mhm.
So we also provide on some clinical trials support around patient retention, certainly for longer trials that might maybe take a couple years. People drop off, they leave the trial, and you can leave a trial if you sign up at any time. But that's not great from a data collection standpoint. So we help clinical researchers retain patients, oftentimes through sort of like patient-based communication. We can help with designing protocols to make them easier to recruit so more people match the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then most importantly, we really can help with selecting investigators and sites. Oftentimes, clinical trials don't necessarily take a sort of deliberative or data-driven approach in terms of how they pick investigators and sites, and there's that can have impact on trial success.
What strategies do you use to raise clinical trial awareness among potential participants?
Yeah, so it all starts really with understanding our sort of target universe and understanding the patients that we're looking to recruit. So we have built a sort of math model that underpins the advertising and outreach work that sort of combines a bunch of data sources. So anything from sort of, CMS and Medicaid data related to services and prescriptions written, demographic information, if there's correlations between the disease state and say, age or other demographic information. And then so we use that to sort of inform our target universe. And then from there, in terms of reaching participants, it can be earned media, so like a radio interview on like a local news station near a trial site, Facebook ads, search for people who may be looking for, typing into Google, symptoms of a specific disease or treatments for that disease. Talking to local newspaper reporters, talking to community-based organizations, which could be a church, it could be a fire department, a mosque. Really, really varies by the trial. And then oftentimes a lot of, for some diseases, if there's a patient advocacy organization, we often do partnerships with that advocacy organization as well. It's all really focused on fundamentally what drives patient throughput and getting patients who qualify for the trial to researchers. And so the exact formula really varies by the disease state, as some diseases are require more advertising. Some can do sort of more community partnerships or others are very focused on sort of disease awareness. It really varies by the type of trial that we're trying to recruit for.
Is this effort driven by the client? Do they give you a set of requirements and say, okay, we want these kinds of participants and we don't want them to have X diseases, et cetera?
Yeah, so oftentimes people hire us because a trial is not going as well as they want. So the number one reason that a clinical trial fails in the United States today is because you don't find enough patients to test the drug on. That is the reason that most trials fail. It's not a financial issue. It's just we just don't find enough patients to be able to accurately assess safety and efficacy of a drug or medical product or diagnostic technology. So generally, by the time we get involved, there is the sites are all set where geographically where they need people, inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we need people who have diabetes, but they don't have a history of heart attacks, or sort of whatever the specific inclusion exclusion criteria is. That is all set by the researchers and is designed to sort of support the endpoints that they're looking for. If we are involved a bit earlier in the process, we can make suggestions on the inclusion exclusion criteria based on our estimations of how many people will meet those. But fundamentally, those at the end of the day are set by the researchers, and especially as medicine is becoming more personalized and treatments are becoming more tailored, you're starting to see very, very narrow inclusion exclusion criteria, especially in the cancer space. In oncology, inclusion exclusion criteria can be very, very specific.
There's a big push for diverse trial participation. How do you tailor your communication to reach diverse populations?
Sure. So if I can actually just step back a second on that question, if all humans are genetically the same, why does diversity even matter in trials, right? Why do we need to recruit a diverse patient population if every single human is genetically the same? And there's a couple reasons for that. Sometimes there can be slight differences in metabolization rates. We all have a friend who can, no matter how many slices of cake they eat, they're effortlessly thin. And there are some, not necessarily with race, but for sort of region of the world where people come from, there are some differences in how quickly people metabolize things, which has impact on safety and impact on dosage. And there are obviously diseases that disproportionately impact specific races or genders or ethnicities. Sickle cell is an obvious example. So is lupus. And if we're not able to recruit patient populations that are reflective of the disease state, we're not going to be able to kick some of these diseases to the dustbin of history. And also too, trial participation does come with benefits. Oftentimes we're working in disease states where there's no existing treatment on the market. And in those situations, a trial could be the only way to get early access to these treatments. And then that really needs to be sort of available and accessible to others. In terms of how we work to promote clinical trial participation among underrepresented groups, it does vary. A lot of the issue comes down to trial selection. Oftentimes, academic institutions will work with other academic institutions. Now that makes a lot of sense, right? Universities have resources. Universities have expertise. They have knowledge. They have experience. It makes a lot of sense to partner with an academic institution. The problem is, however, if you look at where academic institutions are generally located, they're often in kind of wealthier parts of town. They're in maybe whiter parts of town. And they can be kind of hard. They're not well served by public transport. They can be kind of hard to get to for people, for sort of historically underrepresented groups. So a big part of the thing that we like to work on is are we advising our researchers to partner maybe with a federally qualified healthcare center, which sort of serves lower income patients, community facilities like urgent care clinics. There are other sort of embedded healthcare facilities which can often do a better job, or also be able to reach a more diverse audience, even if they don't have the same low level expertise as an academic institution does. Other strategies that we do, really making sure that the imagery that we're putting out in advertising is representative. If you're doing not necessarily just by race or ethnicity, so people can sort of see themselves in the trial, but also too, does the age or lifestyle of the photo actually reflect our patient population. You know, recently we've done work on osteoarthritis trials. That it skews older. You don't want to put a fit young person in the banner ad. You know, you want maybe, you know, an older African American or Asian American, or you need an older person to sort of really match the trial demographics. People need to see themselves in the ads to realize that it's for them. There's some stuff you can do with data analytics. So the CDC publishes disease incidence rates by zip code and by census tract. So you can overlay that with demographic information, and we can say, oh, you know, in this specific neighborhood, we see a large amount of the disease that we're looking for, and also a large amount of, you know, African American or Hispanic residents. So that could be a good neighborhood to focus our Facebook ads in, bus ads, that kind of stuff. A lot of stuff around community outreach. So, you know, going into these neighborhoods that we've identified as high rates of disease, high rates of non-white residents, you know, are we partnering? Do we have information outside of, say, supermarkets, churches, mosques, temples? Are we partnering with, one thing we did during the COVID trial, actually, we partnered with the Public Transport Authority in Miami-Dade County in Florida. That reaches a low income and diverse audience and makes our trial accessible to everyone. And then another thing too is really looking at the investigators and trying to identify, you're using data analytics, you know, who is quoted commonly in you know, ethnic affinity newspapers, who is commonly on the news talking about this disease state, who has credibility within, you know, all types of communities in near trial sites that we're going, and can we make a strategic selection with investigators to make sure that we are picking people who are trusted, respected, credible, known to all populations near the trial site, but particularly for underrepresented groups. And then there's also to simply, you know, putting your money where your mouth is. So, you know, are we making the kind of advertising investments that we need to make with African American newspapers? Are we targeting our you know, advertising dollars to reach, you know, everyone who is eligible and should participate in the trial? And you know, are we actually putting in the effort, both financially and in labor hours, to reaching you know, diverse communities, and sort of making the trial accessible to everyone?
Okay, so I have a disease.
Mm-hmm.
There's no known medication that I have access to, but there may be a clinical trial. Walk us through the initial steps a patient needs to enroll in a clinical trial. Where would I start?
So the federal government, in theory, keeps the database at clinicaltrials.gov. I say in theory. Everything is there. It's not always the most accurate of databases. Oftentimes, it's a very... If it was easy for you to find, I wouldn't have a business. In short, we wouldn't have this as a business. This wouldn't exist. Oftentimes, academic institutions, they will post trials on their website, but it's very sort of scattershot, and it's very difficult for people to discover a clinical trial for themselves. There are some exceptions to that. Rare disease, like if there's a disease where, you know, there's, you know, 300 patients in the US, there's probably a very well organized disease awareness society that knows where those 300 people are and knows the 2 or 3 trials that are going on and can connect people. Most diseases, that isn't true. When we worked on the COVID trial, and you got a positive, we were looking for people who had just gotten a positive COVID test. But if you got a COVID test, you're not thinking, oh, I should go join a trial to find a treatment for this disease. It wasn't even registering in people's minds.
Right.
Oftentimes how people discover the trials is because, you know, we serve a Facebook ad or a Google ad or a search ad to them. And we do that based off of, you know, you're looking at content related to that specific disease. You might live in an area with a high prevalence of it. You're searching, like, for, you know, COVID's in my mind, like, oh, I can't smell my candle. Boom, we can serve an ad to you on that because it's a symptom of the disease. And then oftentimes from there, patients can go on a kind of long journey. Oftentimes people will discover our ad, then they'll go look at the clinical trials websites, they'll search around to see if there's news articles, and then they'll sort of come back in to our trial website, and they'll sign up to have a conversation with with an investigator.
That sounds though like you have to have a certain amount of sophistication as a patient to even begin that journey. What about you know, someone who is low income or marginalized and doesn't have, or let's say, you know, they're working, you know, 12
Sure.
hours a day and they just don't have the means or the time for that kind of research?
Yeah. One thing that, I mean, if there is sometimes primary care physicians or in some institutions are kind of good at funneling people from the clinical side of the entity to the research side of the entity, and identifying patients who might be eligible during like a traditional medical sort of checkup. But we all know that lots of people don't have a primary care physician, and
Exactly.
for a lot of people, especially lower income people, and especially in the American healthcare system, access to care can be an issue. Oftentimes during the COVID trial, it's a little easier because we were able to, go to COVID testing facilities and stand outside of them with signs and information on the trial for people who were in a very distant and COVID safe way, for people who were, potentially, able to enroll. And we in that example of we hired people who had multiple jobs who caught COVID during their shift at a fast food establishment. But it's that we also do generally, it varies by trial, but we often try to do more to relieve the financial burdens of participation. So oftentimes people are most trials compensate people for their time and effort in the trial. It's a reimbursement. How much money that is varies quite drastically. Sometimes it's a couple $100. Sometimes it could be a few thousand. Oftentimes we encourage researchers to budget for paid transportation to bring people to trial sites who might not live near them. And then a lot of people really discover our trial through advertising, I would say mostly. Yeah.
Okay, so they've discovered the trial through advertising, and then
So they discover the trial through advertising. Sometimes people sign up right there and then. That's the only nudge they need. They see, oh, it's with the big university down the street from my house. I'll go sign up or in my town, I'll go sign up for the trial. Other people will leave and they go Google around. They'll be, they'll search for it. Maybe they find a local news article where the principal investigator is being interviewed by, the local TV affiliate. They'll listen to that interview. They'll sort of do their own research and go, okay, this is a legitimate thing. This isn't a scam. And they'll go through and sign up. We have noticed actually when people do sign up in our initial contact us form, we generally don't require a last name. We've noticed that people are a little hesitant to give up their full identity, but will happily give their first name and a phone number to learn a bit more. And so oftentimes we sort of will just push people through the funnel, and then we will do a bit of initial pre-screening, just to check to make sure that you meet the inclusion exclusion criteria, because it's not good for the patient and it's not good for the researcher for us to send you to a site. Especially if you have to take time out of your day for a physical workup, to find out that you are not eligible to participate. So we try to only put people forward who are eligible to participate.
okay, so that leads me to an important question, because you talked about the inclusion exclusion and then the physical workup, which means that you've made it through the inclusion exclusion part of the screening, right? Okay, so now you got to the physical workup, and have you found, or better question, what have you found? If you could give it as a percentage of how many people end up being excluded in the screening process. So
So
let's say
if
you have 100 people, how many of those people end up making it through the physical workup?
that varies, I think, drastically by disease. I would say by the time you've gotten to the physical workup, you will pretty much be, unless something is discovered in that, uh, which will probably be, is probably a comorbidity issue that you weren't aware about, which is, probably a good thing to have discovered. It's pretty unlikely at that point to have failed. So, you'll get a basic screening on our website or our call center, which is not complicated. It's just generally 3 or 4 questions. Do you meet like the big ticket requirements for the trial? Are you within a certain age band generally? Do you have a diagnosis of this disease? Are you taking a specific medicine that's excluded? From there, those leads get sent to basically the site, the clinical researchers, and at that point, they will often do a more detailed phone screen to make sure you tick, every single box on the inclusion exclusion criteria. There's generally like 15 boxes that have to be ticked, and we pre-screen for about 4. And then from there, people will be brought in for a workup. People in some conditions like neurology, so like Alzheimer's or cognitive decline, failure rates can be a bit higher. But some of that's also an issue with self-selection. So people who raise their hands and saying, hey, I've realized my memory isn't as good as it was 5 years ago, are often people who have better memory or hypochondriacs. So that could be a challenge within the neurology space. And those kind of diagnoses are a bit, there's objective criteria to cognitive decline, but it's fundamentally there's a value, there's like a judgment call that a medical professional has to make. And so failure rates in those cases can be a bit higher. In our COVID study, for example, where it was, are you over 18? And do you have a COVID test in the last 5 days? Hardly anyone failed at the screening point because those were basically the only 2 criteria. When it gets more complex, when there's more exclusions, the failure rates go up.